So before we begin our discussion, each panelist is going to give a brief presentation summarizing their essay included in the exhibition catalog, sorry. So we'll start with you, Caitlin.
Excellent. Thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Liz and Kim and everyone for the invitation to speak this evening. As Margaret said, I'm going to give a brief overview of an essay that I contributed that was entitled Color in the Corners, and we got to go one more forward. And Color in the Corners was a title that came a little bit later, and it's based on an observation of some of the paintings that Mrs. Bradley collected. But I started thinking about the Bradley collection with early 20th century painting, what we might call abstract expressionism or simply expressionism in both Germany and France. There are great examples of those historical periods and movements in this collection. But then for example, this fantastic 1913 Kandinsky. But then I started thinking a little bit more broadly when it came time to contribute the catalog essay. And there's a passage in the essay that says that there's a 20th century sized gap between the type of abstraction that Kandinsky was practicing and the type of abstraction that someone like Ellsworth Kelly was practicing. We use the same word to describe both modes of art making, but there is a huge intellectual leap that takes place across the 20th century. And when people think about what happens intellectually across, say, 1900 to 1960, 1970, people first might think of revolutions like Cubism or Surrealism, Dada, but there are really powerful and profound leaps of thought that are taking place in the realm of color too, and the Bradley collection has fantastic artworks that can help us explore that. So, one of the paintings that I was very interested in was the great Vlaminck 1905 wheat field. This is a classic example of fauvism or expressionism as it was practiced in France. And I would venture that one of the reasons that we don't necessarily think about advancements in color in the 20th century in the same way that we do advancements like Cubism, Dada, Surrealism, is the fact that in the 19th century, there are also huge advancements in terms of color. So in the essay, I illustrate this comparison with the Van Gogh wheat field next to the Vlaminck wheat field. And in both of these paintings, there is a great sense of movement. The expression in the picture happens through impasto, through individuated brush strokes that you can really see moving across the surface. And one of the places where expressionism is maybe most pronounced is places like in the Vlaminck, where that wheat field, which we know was not red, is painted red, right? That's sort of a surplus of expression and emotion are being put into the picture with a color that is maybe more corresponding to the artist's emotions than it is to what they're seeing before them. That, in a nutshell, is what we see in fauvism. And there's also a fantastic example, this great Georges Braque nude, which made me think a great deal about the painting Femme au Chapeau, which was the success de scandale in the 1905 Salon de Tome, where the critics begin speaking of this cage of fauves or wild beasts who are using color in such an expressive manner, not describing what they see, but imparting emotion to the picture plane. And in addition to this comparison that I discuss a little bit in my essay between the Braque and the Matisse, it also became clear that in Germany we can look to the work of Kirchner, and that this fantastic painting of Dodo with the large feather is also deeply indebted to fauvism. But we're beginning to see new uses of color on the picture plane between two works like this. So I'll just stop for a moment and say, while both of these paintings are figural in some ways, we're beginning to see a phenomenon that Matisse would describe as expression by design. And that is, if I can just try to encapsulate this idea, that the expressive qualities of his picture, and maybe I'll go back to this one since I am talking about Matisse here, that the expressive qualities of his pictures aren't based on the posture of the figure or the facial expression, but it's really about the distribution of color across the surface. And what we're starting to see in these paintings of the early 20th century is areas of color in the ground behind the figure that are becoming larger and unmodulated. So when we shift from these two paintings here to Dodo, now the color, it's really flat and broad, and it's beginning to have its own expressive force. Color starts to have a power that almost operates a little bit sculpturally. You feel it in your body, and the artists are trying to move color across the surface to create an effect that is registered by you as a viewer overall across the surface. One of the ways that this is described is a shift in thinking about color in a matter of qualities to quantities. And one of the artists who thinks about this a great deal is Matisse, who makes a very provocative statement that a square meter of blue is bluer than a square centimeter of blue. Right? And that's something that artists are going to start playing with a great deal, and you can truly see that principle at play throughout the Bradley collection. So I was interested, excuse me, in the works of Jawlensky, works that both seem totally abstract, non-objective, like this painting, and also great portraits like this, where you can test that idea. Is the expression here in the figure's face, this sort of wonderful sort of upside-down U of the figure's sort of smile, furrowed brow? Is that where expression is coming from? Or is it coming from the way that color is balanced behind him, those two broad areas of yellow? And it's in paintings like this where you can start to see why I might have used the phrase like color in the corners, because as artists are working with figures, they're also starting to apply color across the field of the surface, responding to the rectangle of the canvas as much as to the subject matter of the picture. I'm going to say a word later on about this Paul Klee, so I'll move through this right now. But Matisse was a very important figure for me in my essay in the way that he is thinking about expression by design and placing color across the entire surface of his canvas, and then also in some works on paper too. So I conclude in works of the 1950s, more contemporaneous with Mrs. Bradley's own collecting, and Matisse's great cutouts, which he was making around the time that he made that comment about a square meter of blue being bluer than a square centimeter of blue. So those are sort of in broad brushstrokes the ideas that I was interested in my essay, and helping us think about how artists could move from something that was early 20th century abstract expressionism to something that looks like a monochromatic canvas, and what were the ideas that were motivating those shifts across the 50-year span that we see in these artworks. And I'll just preview a few additional paintings that also might be used to support the observation about color in the corners, and artists who are thinking about expression as a matter of design. So that's probably about 5 minutes? Okay, great. Here.
Thank you, Caitlin. And It's interesting that your essay uses Matisse to illustrate the way that she's looking at color, because of course, if you asked Peg Bradley, Matisse is the one that got away. She never was able to collect a work by Matisse, and she regretted it, openly regretted it. And so you can see that he was somebody who she was certainly looking at.
He's absolutely an influence in his writings. You know, his ideas are getting out to other figures, and I think the Kirchner is kind of an homage to Matisse.
Right, yeah. Okay, all right, Nikki.
All right, thanks everybody for coming. So my essay in the catalog focuses on prints and drawings in the Bradley collection. And this is the area that she started collecting first, and it also made up the majority of her collection throughout the 1950s and early 1960s. So drawing is really where she began as a collector. So I was looking at that and how that shaped her collecting once she started to collect other media as well. And as I was approaching this essay, I was trying to think or find a point of connection within the Works on Paper collection, and that was not easy to do because the works are not related stylistically. But as I sat with them and kind of lived with them a little bit longer, I started to realize that they do share properties of the way that artists think about drawing. And then that led me to argue that the approach that Peg Bradley took to collecting was very similar to some of the properties of drawing as a medium. So I took the approach of a series of case studies. So the properties of drawing and Peg Bradley's collecting that I was thinking about are rapid, responsive, and innovative. So I'll bring you through some of those, and hopefully you'll have a better sense of what I'm saying, because it's a little bit heady at this moment. But first is rapid. So I used this pastel by Degas to illustrate that idea. So if you look carefully at the way that Degas is handling the pastel, he's working very quickly on the paper, and you can see a very gestural mark. He also leaves what are called pentimenti on the paper, where he made a line, decided not to pursue that line, changed course, but the line remains on the paper, it's still visible. So those are called pentimenti. You get the idea that he's working in a very spontaneous fashion. And in a similar way, Peg Bradley really worked quickly once she found an area of collecting that she wanted to pursue. So the example here is the way that she built up French drawing when she first started collecting, because that's what that's how she was introduced to art. She purchased, one of the first works she purchased was a poster by Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, and she went on to buy 25 works by Toulouse-Lautrec in the course of a year. So she really was very rapid in her collecting when she found an area she liked. The next point is responsive. So here I'm using a watercolor by Emil Nolde to illustrate this idea. And Nolde here is working with what's called wet-on-wet watercolor technique, and he started to pursue that because the story goes, he was working outside one day and snow fell on his work, and he saw that the wetness of the snow made his pigments run together, and he liked that effect, so he started to intentionally introduce ways to get his pigments to blend and run together. So here I was arguing that Nolde is very responsive to his materials, and then in a similar way, Peg Bradley really responded to the market and to dealers. So she was very influenced by particular dealers throughout her collecting career. And a great example is when French art, which she started collecting, became out of her reach price-wise. She pivoted very quickly and went to Germans. And one of my favorite quotations from her is she said, "There had to be new men," and as it turned out, they were the Germans. So she made that pivot very quickly, and so she was responding to what was available to her, and she started to buy these really wonderful examples of expressionist art, like by Emil Nolde. And then lastly, innovative. And artists often use drawings in order to work out new ideas or try out experimental techniques. So the work that I'm showing you here is by Paul Klee. And this work is done through a process called oil transfer. And that works when the artist paints black oil paint on the back of a sheet of paper, and then they set that face down on a new clean sheet of paper, and they draw on the back of the paper that has the paint on it. And doing that causes the oil paint to transfer from the top paper to the bottom paper. So the outlines that you see are things that Clay drew on the back of a piece of paper that had oil paint on it, and it went on to a second piece of paper. So you can see too that captures the movement of his hand. There's some incidental marks where his hand pressed on the paper while he was drawing. And Clay was a member of the Bauhaus School in Germany, and the pedagogy of the school really emphasized moving away from received knowledge in art education. So there was a lot of emphasis on experimenting and trying new techniques, and that's exactly what Clay is doing here. And similarly, Peg Bradley was quite an innovative collector, especially for the Midwest in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. She was really looking towards artists that people in Wisconsin still found challenging and a little unusual. So she pursued an art that was challenging at the time, but is now really well respected, well received. And so she was pursuing an innovative path in a similar way to some of the artists that she collected. So my argument is that this early experience collecting drawings held fast as she expanded her collecting outlook, and she continued to pursue rapid, responsive, and innovative approaches, even when she started collecting more paintings and sculpture. And with that, I will pass it to Maren.
Thanks, Nikki. I love that observation that that the collection, picking out her personality traits of the work that reflect in her. It's sort of like when people say that dogs start to look like their owners, or vice versa. I think people who've been collecting art for a long time, and there are many of you in this audience right now, I think there's always a bit of a personality trait in the collection that is based on the collector. Okay, Maren.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. My whole family's from Milwaukee, so it's always really nice to be back, even if thank you for Milwaukee natives, yes. Even if there is a little playoff baseball going on in my backyard tonight, but we won't get into that. We'll get you out by 8. My essay has this perhaps funny title. I think it's kind of funny, but also quite literal in the case of Peg Bradley. So when I was doing research, obviously I only think and write and see in 3 dimensions. I only talk about sculpture. And when I was approaching the essay for the catalog, I came across this great image that was in the Milwaukee Journal. And outside of the fact that this is probably my vision of what heaven looks like, this is where Peg Bradley swam multiple times a day when she was at home. And I was so struck by this work because I do think it's in some ways a kind of perfect encapsulation of her sculpture collection, which we should say is a fairly small percentage, at least of the collection that was eventually donated to the museum. If you go out to Lynde, there's a lot of sculpture there, which I definitely recommend. I'm sure most of you in this room have been out there, but this image not only, I think, speaks to the fact that she lived with her work, which I think is important, right? This was not something that was just collected to go on the walls of a museum, even if that's where it ended up. It really was about joy and enjoyment of that work. And I think that speaks volumes when she, is doing laps and gets to look up at a beautiful Donald Judd on the right, or the Bertoia dandelion on the left. And also I think here, it's kind of hard to see in this image, but just the kind of perfect cross-section of what we now think of today as modern sculpture. And this is what really struck me in terms of looking specifically into the sculpture collecting of Mrs. Bradley, because I think today we can look back, and obviously I've been thinking about Noguchi a lot in my life, but I am always really struck by this installation image from a show he did in 1972 at Gimple Phil's in London. And we think now, I think of this collection as such a modern masterpiece, but we do need to remember that when she's collecting, especially work like this is as contemporary as you could get, right? She's buying directly from galleries, she's buying directly from artists, and it's kind of the most cutting edge work at the time. And what really struck me in terms of looking at the breadth of her collection, because I think I had a kind of similar reaction to you, Nikki, going like, how do you even make sense of this? It's tremendously idiosyncratic, right? And even at the time, people kind of described her as a little bit of a chaos agent, as a collector, right? Like, I'm buying what I like, and I don't care who thinks anything about it, right? And I love that spirit, that she wasn't buying because of trends or because of what people were telling her she needed to buy. She was buying because she liked something and she had a response to something, right? But the end result of this, when you're buying out of galleries, and I just kind of picked 3 works that are all made around 1970. There's this kind of big push, right, like in a 5-year period around the 70s, in 1970, where you get these 3 works, right? And I'm obviously being a little heavy-handed in selecting these images for us. They're all vertical, kind of totemic, abstract figures. But I think for me, it also demonstrates how her sculpture collection has now become what I would describe as like a perfect reflection of what's going on in sculpture, particularly in the United States during the late post-war period. You can look at that collection and really see this seismic shift happening in the medium. And I think if you've seen the show, there's like that great case of bronze work, right? And that's kind of where we start off with modern sculpture. And by the time we get into the 70s, right, we are seeing cupro-nickel alloyed rods that are meant to be activated and make noise, right? So we have a real pretty big shift happening with just in a few decades. And so even though, we have 3 works that perhaps have some formal similarities to them, they really do have a pretty wide, wood, metal, marble, different techniques being used, different nationalities, different movements that they're associated with. And somehow, for me, it's a joy because these 3 works would never be shown together probably. So it's really lovely to see, again, a cross-section of these important works from the time period. So for me, I think the essay really became thinking of how do we look at one collector and actually learn a lot about the history of modern art, particularly during the late post-war period. And I think the fact that she was so prescient in terms of her collecting, she really picked a lot of quote-unquote winners, right? The pieces that she, and the artists that she collected really have stood have stood the test of time. And in some cases, the David Smith Cubi is one of the most important works of American sculpture, period. So it's really lovely that you have that here. And I think the fact that she was able to kind of, spot out those pieces, especially at a time when people maybe weren't really as aware of what the impact of those works were.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Maren. I think I was excited for all of your essays in the catalog for various reasons. As somebody who has indeed been working with this collection for 30 years, I have to say that the collection of sculpture, I think, is. I never met Peg Bradley, but the folkloric stories of her coming through the museum with her, white vinyl go-go boots and, sort of holding court are notorious for MAM employees. You've heard the stories. And I think that she is most adventurous in her collecting in the sculpture. And I think that pays, you can see that connection, and you'll hopefully talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so now I just wanted to pose a few questions to the group, if you want to pass the clicker down. And anyone can answer at any time. But I just wanted to know, so through your research, was there something that you learned about Bradley's approach to her collecting? Something particular, maybe more broadly, or in the areas that you were writing about?
Well, Nikki, you've already mentioned the strengths in German modern art, and I would say, it doesn't take research to discover this, but the Kirchners, the Munters, Kandinsky, those are the envy of any museum in the United States and in Europe as well. It was quite radical to be collecting German art in that depth, with that seriousness at that point in time. So I think that's sort of one hallmark on one hand. But at the same time, I would say Peg Bradley seems to have really liked a particular type of painting that bridges early 20th century modern art and post-war art. And she can find that among American painters, French painters, and German painters. And the way that those, she is bringing together particular trends that museums are not necessarily gravitating toward, but she detects them, and you can see that in the way the exhibition is installed right now, and that's been very interesting for me to see.
I think particularly like the New School of Paris grouping, there's a strength in that. The Hans Hartungs, you'll see it in the show, and that was always a surprise to me when growing up with this collection, that there was such depth in that area.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah, I can go. I was really fascinated by her relationship with dealers throughout her years of collecting. And as I was researching, it appeared that Claymont Galleries in New York was especially influential in shaping the artists that she took an interest in. So on the screen are all artists, or all works that she purchased through Claymont Galleries. So you can see that they're very diverse in terms of style. And Claymont, the first two, the upper left two works, are the first two that she purchased that kicked off her collection, and she bought those from Claymont Galleries, and they continued to really push her in different directions, where she was going from French into German and back to New School of Paris, and really interesting places. She was tapped into this network of German emigre dealers. So Claymont was German, and I think he helped her go into this network of people who had left Germany as the Nazis were coming to power. And so I think Claymont helped her learn about this network, and she approached many of these different German emigre dealers to build her collection through this strength. But the way that she worked with Claymont Galleries especially was very interesting to me.
Just to build on that a little bit, because I also was really struck looking at where these works were being purchased and when they were being purchased, and the way that, at least on the sculpture side of things, she was. You had mentioned she didn't buy one Toulouse-Lautrec, it was 25, right? And there does seem to be this kind of, there was a couple of galleries in Italy which themselves were incredibly pretty avant-garde after the war, showing Italian, European, and artists from the United States together, and kind of going there and just buying en masse, right? It wasn't just I'm just gonna buy one, it's I'll buy the whole show. So I think that's also really interesting that when she saw something that was unusual, that she kind of jumped on it. And then also the way that, she definitely had favorites, I think, amongst gallerists and dealers, but also looking at that spreadsheet of where she was buying from, she really, she spread it around a lot, which I think is also speaking to that kind of idiosyncrasy of her collecting, but also not limiting herself, right, to working with one dealer who was whispering in her ear, just buy this, but really kind of just going where she wanted to go. So I think that kind of independence and innovation of building a collection, there's a kind of fearlessness in it that you see. So,
and again, that kind of matches what you hear about Peg Bradley as a person. It's pretty consistent. Okay, the other thing I asked everybody in advance is, was there something, Marion and Caitlin, you were somewhat new to the Bradley collection, and Nikki, you had more of an insider track, but was there an object that surprised you that was in the collection, or that, or was of a particular interest? And Marion, I'm gonna ask you to go first. You see it on the screen.
So I've spent the last decade of my life working on this artist, Harry Bertoia. And so I was really, I think Liz probably asked me to write on Bertoia for the catalog originally, and then I couldn't help myself. But this is definitely the work that I think is just a showstopper. It's tremendously beautiful, and he's an insanely prolific artist, like well over 10,000 unique works in his lifetime, and he died young. And the dandelions, there's like a handful of them, right? Like it's a very small percentage of what he did, and part of it is because they're tremendously labor intensive. So what we're looking at here is every single piece being hand welded. So every little frond that you see is coming into a weld and then connected to a rod, which is then connected to a center. And so it's, no offense to David Smith, who I clearly just called out and said you have a beautiful example of, but for my money, Bertoia is the greatest welder of the 20th century. And this is one of those works where I think it's just really unique to see them. And I've seen, I think, a lot of them at this point of the small number, and this is one of the best condition ones I've seen. It's really just a showstopper, right? And I think it's a showstopper that maybe a lot of people aren't aware is a showstopper. So for me, it was really nice to see this celebrated here, and I think there's actually very deep holdings of Bertoia across the city of Milwaukee, and part of that I think has to do with Peg Bradley's influence and bringing attention to this artist, and I think he's been maybe a little overlooked or forgotten in recent decades, but it's really nice to see that he is so celebrated here in Milwaukee.
Yeah, there is that Bradley effect, the Peg effect, we call it, where you can see other people starting to collect Bertoia because that's who she was collecting. Our Munter collection is as large as it is because she was collecting works by Gabriel Munter, and then other people saw that and started collecting Gabriel Munter, and then thankfully gave us their paintings as well. So it really helped with our holdings. Nikki.
I cheated and picked two, but I did know the collection, but in certain cases I was surprised to remind myself that they were Bradley collection works, and so the one on the left is by Kurt Schwitters, and she didn't collect any other collages, so I was surprised to see a collage that was part of the Bradley collection, and I was really interested in this collage in particular because Schwitters was really interested in leveling the hierarchies of the types of paper he was using, so he's combining everything from really high quality fabrics to scraps and tobacco wrappers in this instance. So I was just curious about what led her to collect this work when there's nothing else really quite like it in the collection. And the other one is by Jasper Johns, and this is a work that uses after images. So if you look at many of you may already know this trick, but if you look at the target on top at the little black dot in the center, and then look at the dot in the white square at the bottom, the orange, black, and green turn into red, white, and blue. So he's working with this way of thinking about how your brain processes color and how it remains in your brain after you see one color. It might not work on this slide, but if you look in the gallery, it should work. So I was curious about her interest in this kind of scientific way of thinking about color. And I was also really interested in her purchasing from Universal Limited Art Editions, which is one of the first fine art print publishing workshops that came into being in the 1950s, and that was founded by a woman named Tatiana Grossman. So there's a lot made of Peg Bradley being a woman collector and collecting women, and I was interested in this, her reaching out to buy work from this press in addition to the color principles that it espouses.
And I snuck one in for myself, sorry. And this is not a work that necessarily surprised me, but it's a work that I'm very slowly starting to become more and more curious about. Kenzo Okada, as somebody mentioned here, she was collecting work by artists who weren't that well known in the Midwest. This is certainly an example. A Japanese-American artist who was working in New York, but really did not have the sort of, he was having exhibitions. museums and in galleries, but in terms of like compared to the other artists who were working at the time, he wasn't in that same sort of realm. And it was at least 20 years of my being at this museum before anybody put this painting out. And when it went out, I was like, that makes so much sense, because, and ever since then I've been dedicated to getting this painting near the demon corns, and I finally did it in the exhibition because it makes so much sense, and it's what everybody's been saying about how she looks at things, and the connection between those two things is unmistakable. So sorry, I had to sneak that one in. Caitlin.
Maybe could we advance to that? Yeah, so I fell in love with this little Paul Klee from 1938 when I was writing, and it's not the most art historically significant work in the collection, but there's just something wonderful and mischievous about this painting. And I guess I was thinking so much about color as a ground element in paintings in the Bradley collection, and this one, the line is just so active and used with creativity and economy. And in my essay, I talk about how just the small forms that you see at the bottom edge of the painting could be signifying breasts or buttocks, and the lines in her hair are framing her face, but also sort of giving a sense of the contour of a coiffure, and it's a work that I really love. And also the title, The Hot-Blooded Girl, was interesting because I was thinking about issues of expression, but there's something about this painting that also maybe makes you realize that inside your own body there is blood, which is a medium that can be spread in a way that's not so different from paint too. And just finally, there's, you pointed to a love for Bertoia. The very first exhibition that I did as a little baby curator was on Paul Klee and Joseph Albers, and in your exhibition you have them, two Bauhaus artists installed around the corner from each other, which was, I thought, a really nice note. So that's why I chose this painting.
Yeah, great. And do you think there are strategies around how she approached color when she was collecting? I mean, maybe not intentionally at first, but if you were kind of retroactively looking back.
I think she absolutely understood that there were 20th century paintings with figural elements, right? So some visual reference points to things in the world that could be depicted in a flat, sort of shallow pictorial space with color that starts to have a kind of a sculptural effect. And I realize that is maybe a little bit of an abstract thing to say, but there really is a forcefulness in the way that color is applied in the paintings in a very direct way that I think Mrs. Bradley had a real eye for.
Yeah, and I think it's a lot of times you hear about her approach to color. It's linked to her, she had a career in fashion, and you can hear it being said almost as like well, she's a woman, of course she likes color. And that just doesn't hold up when you look at the approach she made. I mean, your essay lays it all out. This was not, this was a very confident and avant-garde approach to color.
Absolutely, and it's a type of collecting where you can say, okay, it's idiosyncratic, but it's also done with done in such a way that it accords with a lot of theory of color across the 20th century too. That doesn't have to have been what was driving it, but it's very sort of selective and savvy, and we could sort of do an explication of color theory in the 20th century through this collection, if we wanted to.
Yeah.
But also, I'd say not even just with color, but I mean, turning the corner and seeing the Giacometti, Solange, I mean, what a knockout of a corner, right? Like, and that's, oh good, you're getting the thumbs up. Maybe it was controversial, but like, the lack of color, just like this mess of black just form hitting you where, she's not just relying on like I'm betraying my non-painterly person self here, but like it's not just about like, oh, color's easy, right? Like it knocks you on your socks just based on these bright, bold, beautiful colors. But even in those works that doesn't happen as much. Yeah.
Well, and I'll just say it's an understanding of how color works at scale. That is really, she has an eye for that.
Yeah, for sure. So, Nikki, I wanted to ask you something about, there are two artists in the Works on Paper collection that she collected in great depth, but stylistically they're not too similar. And one is Lionel Feininger, and the other is Emil Nolde. So can you talk about both artists and what is there a commonality there that explains the sort of all-in kind of approach to it?
I think it comes to the market first, I think. She collected a lot of Feininger, and that was similar to the Toulouse-Lautrec, where she was introduced to him, and then she bought several at once from many different dealers, and she pursued Feiningers when she couldn't find the ones that she wanted through downtown galleries. She called other people and finally got the number that she wanted. And then Nolde, she first bought through Claymont galleries, so that's another way that they pushed her in one direction. So and most of her Nolde works in her collection are these florals, and there's one portrait. But as Margaret said, they are not terribly stylistically similar, but if you go to the next one, it again is a similarity in how they're approaching the medium. So if you look very carefully at the boat in the center and then the stems of the flowers in the Nolde, you can see the way that both artists are allowing the pigments to run and make these nice little spindles that come out from the central forms. And I think she's really attracted to that idea of seeing the way that an artist is thinking and seeing the spontaneity in their approach, and the way that the materials are another voice or a collaborator with the artist. And so looking very closely at the works is what helped me to see this kind of through line between things that are very kind of angular, geometric, and things that are very soft and natural. So I think that interest in materials, it kind of links them together, and the way that forces in the market helped her.
And what did she say about her Noldes?
A journalist asked her to say which were her favorite works of art, and she wouldn't name individual pieces, but she said, as far as groupings, I love my Noldes. So.
Yeah. Okay, so before we open it up for questions from the audience, I have one more question for you, Merritt. And so we see, as you walk through the exhibition, you see basically the paintings she's collecting are growing in size. And one thing I want to point out about the exhibition is that each of the labels has the gallery that Mrs. Bradley bought the work from and the date. And I want to shout out Catherine Sawinski, who is our manager of curatorial research, who did all of that research. And really, it's the first time, yes, yay, Catherine. It's the first time we understand that she was growing in scale in paintings, and as well, does the scale of the sculpture kind of parallel that track?
Yeah, absolutely. And part of that is just, I think, again, broader trends happening in modern, or at that time, contemporary art. So scale becomes something that a lot of people are very interested in. And this is a kind of misleading photo, actually, of, of the lower, because it's not that large. But yeah, you can kind of get a sense with the sculpture garden, which originally was going to be a much larger botanic garden, and then she started collecting more sculpture and needed more room for that sculpture. And sculpture just took over everything, which awesome. I love that happened. So, and I think this is also why, there's very small numbers of concentrated sculpture collections, especially in the United States too, right? Because you need more space to display sculpture and to store sculpture, and it's cumbersome to move around. But I think one of the things that's really quite incredible, for me, and I had visited, but in doing the research kind of about the sculpture collecting and the need for more space for this collection is also thinking that a lot of those works that are still on site, she placed, right? Or she directed people to place with machinery, but that she was out there kind of citing things, right? And I think that's something that, even if we're thinking just about her kind of taste level and amazing eye, that really did transfer to space, which is also something that I think is, sculpture has its own unique language, right? Its own demands, and a lot of people are kind of, quite frankly, intimidated by it, and so kind of just don't deal with it. And I think the fact that she was able to, be such an amazing, have such an amazing eye for color and for painting, and then also still be, have this incredible acumen for collecting sculpture, is also pretty remarkable. And definitely, I think, the scale grows. If we think back to that case of small bronzes, and then looking at works that are outside, or the Lieberman that's out on the lakefront, this idea again of collecting what was contemporary. And as she gets later into the collecting, things are just getting larger. But there's also, I think, one of the things that I touch on briefly in the essay is the fact that there's a number of models in her collection as well. And I think that's also really fascinating, that she's thinking about work that, even if she couldn't collect the full-size version of it, that there was a concept that sculpture could be scaled up, could grow larger, could be, again, in the public sphere. And I think that, for me, when you look at something like the works at the Sculpture Garden, or the works, the sculpture works here, thinking back to that swimming pool, right? Like, these, again, were things that inhabit our space with us. That's why I think where the immense power of sculpture comes from, right? There are these weird things that inhabit our space and take up space, and we have to navigate around. And I think she very much saw something in it that had public function and public use, and that people can enjoy. So, I mean, what a testament that we can go to this place and see sculpture in nature. Because I think if you were going to press me and be like, what's the one thing that we can kind of see in her sculpture collection, there is an odd, even in the most abstract of works, there does feel like there's a kind of organic quality to them, or an interest in nature. So to see then those works displayed in nature, I think, is a really tremendous thing.
Yeah, and I love, there's a line in your essay where you say, in the understatement of the year, she was not afraid of scale. Okay, you've had your time to think of questions. We don't have a lot of time for questions, but if you have a question, please raise your hand. Okay, we'll go first.
What percent of the total collection are we seeing in the current exhibit?
The question is, what percentage of the whole Bradley collection are we seeing in the current exhibition? Yeah, 25%? Yeah, about a quarter of it, yes. Megan. So the question is, she collected certain artists in depth, and a few of them, Munter and Hepworth, are women. And so she was asked that question point blank, and there's an interview with her where it was Mike Danoff, right, who asked her. So he was the director of the museum at the time, and he was documenting the collection with her. They're walking through the collection. It's in like the early 75, yeah. Oh, the fashion. Oh, my goodness. His fashion, not hers. She was impeccable. But he's walking around with like this tape recorder, recording her. And he kind of asked that question, and she says, "I'm not a women's libber," basically. But I think there is, I think you can't deny that many of the artists she did collect in depth were women. Now, that could be a market thing, which it seems like a lot of her collecting was. The work by women artists would probably be less expensive, but I do think there were things about women artists. She knew a lot of women gallerists and other women collectors, and so I think there was something, maybe it was subliminal. Yes, in the back. The question is, what was her background in art prior to buying art? Well, she didn't really, I mean, she was in the fashion world, is probably the most influential thing that kind of made the association with collecting. There was a dress shop, Milwaukeeans, you'll remember the Zeta dress shops, and she started working there just as an employee, and then eventually ended up managing them and then owning them, and would go to New York on buying trips and things like that. And so I think that was the kind of connection the road into art that she found.
And there was another department store owner who, I forget the name of the department store.
Gimbel's.
Gimbel's. So he was an art collector, and he became friends with Peg Bradley, and he is really the person who pushed her to start collecting art because he was a collector. So it was through fashion, but also like the influence of her friends in the fashion world and help from other collectors.
Yeah. Yes.
So we've talked a lot, I love this kind of curation of sculpture that we're ending with this slide here. Have you found in all of Hannah's research that Peg would reframe works, or how did this thought of framing consider her collecting practices, or does she think about reframing works, or just because she has so many varied dealers working with those kinds of individual framing practices for like 2D works?
You're asking about the physical frames on works? Is that what you're asking? I mean, she was a collector who would take the frames for paintings that were from the gallery. And I think many of the works that are in the show and will be in the reinstallation of the modern collection in the spring many of the frames are the original frames that she got them in. She herself, as far as I know, and Catherine, if you know anything, pipe up, but I don't know of her actively reframing paintings. We have done a lot of reframing to kind of put paintings into period-appropriate frames. But I don't think it was a wide-scale practice that she did. Okay, last question. Heidi.
I'm curious about when she was collecting, was it mostly contemporary artists at the time, or was it a mix of contemporary artists and older works of art that she was acquiring, maybe even second, third time around the bend? And to that end, did she, when you were noticing when and where she collected, did she ever collect directly from artists or have friendships with artists?
Anybody can pipe in if they want.
The oldest work, so when she first started collecting, it was a mixture of historical and contemporary because she started with Toulouse-Lautrec, and he was a late 19th century artist, and she started in the 50s. So he was a historical artist at that point, and so was Degas and Bonnard, who she also collected at first. And then I think as she became more confident, she started to collect more contemporary artists, and there are a lot of examples of her buying works the year they were made, or I don't recall if she had direct relationships with artists. I know Georgia O'Keeffe came to visit when Georgia O'Keeffe was older, and Peg visited with her while she was here, but I think she came not to visit Peg, but for a different reason. So I know she met artists, but I don't know that she was following artists. I guess Alex Katz knew her as well. So she had relationships with a few contemporary artists, but a lot of what she did was through through galleries or the secondary market.
She did buy one O'Keeffe painting directly from the artist. I'm sure the gallery didn't know that at the time.
Yeah. and just to add, there's a beautiful wall that has two Georges Braque paintings next to each other. The Dry Dock, which was among the first, if not the first, paintings that she acquired. So that's a work made later in Braque's career. And then right next to it is the painting from 1906. Braque has produced hundreds of paintings between the two of them, and she acquires them within 3 years of each other, and both of those were purchased during his lifetime.
And I think on the sculpture side, the one thing I'll just say quickly is that So one of the works, I also could have picked it for like my most interesting work, is a failed commission that would have been realized for Marquette Park and wasn't, by the sculptor Richard Lippold, another native Milwaukeean. And she buys the model and the maquette. So she did work closely with him on that project, even though it fell apart. Sorry.
Yeah. Good questions, everybody. Okay, so thank you, panelists. This was really great. It's so much fun to be able to reap the rewards of your research. Thank you to Liz, who really is the mind behind all of this push to get the scholarship done on this collection. Really, the catalog, everybody should go to the store, get it right now. The essays are as engaging as this conversation, and there are other great essays in the catalog as well. So thank you all for coming out tonight, and go Brewers!